I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today we have a very special guest on the podcast. Megan Walsh is the author of Subplot, a recently published book on modern Chinese literature, particularly Chinese literature in the last 2 decades. I read it and I was really stunned by how much I didn't know. Rob, I don't know about you, but there was so much in this book that I just had no idea about. This is a great resource. Thank you so much, Megan, for writing this and for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for asking me.
Yeah, as Lee mentioned, this was as literary scholars, and I say that with as pretentious a voice as I can, we sometimes think that, hey, I think I've got this whole modern Chinese lit thing down. And then we read a book like yours and go, oh, except for something like crime fiction and web literature and all this other stuff that, frankly, most Chinese people read and we don't. So it was really exciting to be introduced to this. And it was really exciting also to just see someone say, hang on, before we dig too much into all of the other politics and stuff, can we please focus for a bit on what are people just reading, right? This is a huge part of a culture. And I think this is the first book I've seen. Lee, you can correct me here. This is the first book I've seen, I don't know ever, but certainly in a really long time, that is a contemporary book on contemporary China that focuses just on reading and on books.
I think you might be right. Megan, I guess first question, and I think this is probably an easy one. What are you reading right now in Chinese literature?
Well, I've actually taken a little bit of a break from reading Chinese fiction just because the last 2 years have been completely and utterly steeped in it. And I actually sort of felt like to get a proper sort of perspective on things again, I just needed to take a deep breath and just read a few things outside of what has been the focus for what feels like a very long time. So I've been, I'm actually reading the third Elena Ferrante book, which I sort of stopped reading when I took on this project. So I will return to Chinese fiction very, very soon, but I'm having a little break.
So one of the things that I loved about this book is that it's one of the first books for a general audience to finally remind people, or maybe introduce them to the idea that for the first time that there is a distinct bias among Western publishers, Western academics, towards just the Chinese fiction that's quote-unquote political. If it's can be seen as against the party or against the government or against power structures, those are the classics and everything else kind of just gets swept under the rug. So a 2-part question with that. 1, where does this come from? And 2, how is the modern Chinese literary landscape right now really not like that at all?
Yeah, so I think it's something that I was aware that I even had when I started reading Chinese fiction. All the stuff that I started with was mainly the kind of dissident fiction, so Ma Jian and people like that. And I really loved it. I don't sort of want to imply that it's not worth reading. But I quickly became aware that because of that, I was also kind of engaging with a much broader discourse in a way about China as friend or foe and how we define ourselves in opposition to how Chinese artists and writers have to operate given the, I guess, sort of authoritarian intervention that they sometimes have to deal with. For me, that was a huge part of the appeal, and I didn't want to in any way shut myself off from the writers who live and work there and are still trying to process and understand society and their own individual paths through fiction just because they work within a different, I guess, set of notes or edict. So that's been a huge part of why I've always been drawn to Chinese fiction and why I like it so much. In terms of the second question, in terms of how it's different on the ground, I think, of course, you can find examples of fiction that absolutely does pander to what one would imagine the government wants to read. But in general, I think it's pretty hard to, if you are an artist and a writer, to write what you're supposed to. I think part of the artistic process is, has a life of its own. And even fiction like web fiction, it's pretty bad. It's people are churning out 10, 20,000 words a day. They're still not writing what they should be writing. It's a kind of almost like Ghost in the Machine that the more you read, the more you realise there's a whole range of kind of literary phenomena and ideas and experiences that people are processing and writing about that is not part of the master narrative.
In your book, you talk about a variety of different literary forms that I really knew very little about. I am not a big science fiction fan, but your reading you convinced me that Chinese science fiction is something I need to be paying more attention to. I was wondering, what is the form that in this project, the literary form or the genre that you discovered that most surprised you? So was it, I mean, you talked about science fiction, but then you also talked about web fiction, and you talked about the danmei genre. What was the biggest surprise for you?
It's a really good question. I think part of the process of researching the book was following that feeling of surprise quite a lot. I think that the seed of the book started with migrant worker poetry, which was a whole arena that I hadn't been aware of until I wrote my dissertation about it. It felt, I started to sort of see that there are kind of literary phenomena that exist in China that just don't exist here. And then, as you say, web fiction was sort of staggering. The amount that young people are reading is just incomparable to how people are reading here. But the content was also, after you sort of read a few of them, remarkably unsurprising. You know, you kept on seeing the same things over and over again. You mentioned sort of sci-fi. I find it a very addictive form in terms of what Chinese writers are exploring, and they're genuinely quite excited about the future, which in its own right feels quite addictive when you're in a kind of, I think I've heard you mention in a kind of Ray Bradbury-esque way. It does feel innocent, but also sort of deeply informed and, I don't know, invested in something that we've backed away from a little bit in our field of sci-fi in the West. I know I could sort of go on. I felt like most of the genres surprised me in some way because they don't replicate what we have here.
I have to jump in on the sci-fi thing because I have to say, Lee, I'm deeply hurt that after all these years of telling you need to read more sci-fi and having you tell me that sci-fi as a genre just sucks. One book, man, a couple of pages in a book and you're a convert. I don't get it, you know? Actually, it's interesting because one of the things, Lee, that has sort of swung you over is Chinese sci-fi. We've covered now a couple of stories, and in all cases, you were like, this is a really good story. You know, Megan, you're right. Chinese sci-fi, especially if you read a lot of sci-fi in general, is very surprising. And part of it is that optimism. My first real introduction to this, like a lot of people, was Liu Cixin. What was fascinating about that was the political angle comes back in, right? There's a tendency to want to see this as a response to something. It's deeply rooted in an event during the Cultural Revolution, so there's a tendency to go, aha, see, here we go, here's the political angle. But one of the things that I think is noteworthy about Chinese science fiction is how it will take something from the past, the Cultural Revolution, a real event, but take it in a very different direction. So I'm curious what you think about this sense of optimism Chinese sci-fi tends to have about what you call in your book a post-humanist future, which is, you know, people and machines all combined together. Do you see this as sort of a response to a very difficult century for China, as in things were bad, but look, now they're getting better and they're just going to keep getting better? Is it part of a general sense of optimism, or is it something totally different, do you think?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think, especially with something like the three-body problem, it draws attention to the brutality that I guess a lot of people weren't able to properly face up to and engage with, and that seed grew inside them, and you know, he's taken that, as you say, in a very interesting trajectory into intergalactic warfare. In terms of China's history, that is a huge part of it. But I also think that I guess in the last sort of 30 years, China's sort of economic transformation has coincided with a real kind of technological boom. There's AI and handheld technology and, you know, to a lesser degree, in an exciting way, of mass surveillance and things. But, you know, the internet in particular has transformed everything. But I think Chinese people tend to associate technology as something that has come of age with them and improved their lives ultimately. So they don't have the same dystopian notions about where it might end up in the way that we do. And I also think part of the legacy, in a way, of a kind of broken artistic heritage, you know, when there's been sort of no organic development really of a publishing industry because of Mao and Cultural Revolution and things. I guess they know what it's like to have had sort of culture gutted, and they are much more excited about a future potentially even without humans in it. It doesn't feel so, you know, the arts are ultimately the humanities. It's pegged to what we produce and what we say about ourselves and our place in the world. I think they're genuinely open to the idea that we can improve on ourselves, that something might get better. We've caused enough problems, and that doesn't feel bleak in Chinese science fiction. It feels like a genuine source of inquiry and exploration.
I was curious. So you talk about the sort of the way that Chinese fiction writers navigate politics, and you compare Ma Jian with Yan Lianke, and you talk about this sort of post-truth environment and how these Chinese authors frequently have to adapt to the politics of their place. And I was struck several times in reading your book that it almost seems like, because of the navigation of politics in China, that Chinese fiction is kind of the forerunner of the post-truth, maybe postmodern. I don't know if I should use that term, but fiction everywhere. Do you see Chinese fiction in some way kind of being the avant-garde of the problems that we're trying to deal with now in the US and the UK and maybe the rest of the world outside of China? Or am I reading too much into that?
No, I think inadvertently so, yeah. I think because Chinese writers have had to live, and they're really used to a sense of an official narrative, and even though that shifts a lot and in terms of what boundaries can be stretched within that, I think they're very aware that the reality that is part of that official narrative is not the reality shared by people in day-to-day life, from one village to one city, and that is an absolutely kind of integral part of their fiction also. And I think a lot of them, especially of the older generation who grew up under the red flag, so to speak, are really aware of their role as metaphor themselves, and they use metaphors very knowingly to challenge how, I guess, individual narratives are slightly drowned out by these sort of broad brush versions of history and even the present. And I think that's something that we have always assumed doesn't really affect us, that it's, we don't have we don't have to question the history that we're telling ourselves. And obviously in the last, 3 or 4 years, especially in the last couple of years, really, we've all become aware that we're not actually on the same page in the way that we perhaps assumed we were. And a lot of writers have been aware of that for quite some time, I think, that there is a kind of reality crisis. And I think they really could just turn to a lot of Chinese writers to see that they have been grappling with that for decades.
One of the sections I liked the most in your book, just because these are the writers I like, was the chapter where you're talking about Yan Lianke and San Xue and some of the other writers who grew up, like you say, under the red flag and who developed careers that definitely don't fit there. Yan Lianke is probably my favorite novelist well in this era. Yeah, the very first novel I ever read all the way through in Chinese was Dream of Ding Village. I remember being struck by how it felt quote-unquote political and also sort of not at the same time. It's something I've always admired about him, that his characters, even at their most satirical, are never placeholders. They're actual people with real desires and wishes and things like that. And yet, you hold them up against San Xue, whose fiction is just could not be more different in many ways. And, Lee's question dealing with Chinese fiction being sort of in the avant-garde, what are some lessons to take away from this variety in the Chinese response? You have someone like Yan Lianke, who's both a satirist but also a very serious creator of characters, and someone like San Xue, who's clearly in the avant-garde. What are some lessons the West can take away from that?
I don't really know at this point. I think the one thing that, as you say, in terms of the very kind of singular ways that they have honed their voices to deal with arguably quite a kind of similar challenge, which is to make their own worldview heard within a culture in which that's not really tolerated, is to kind of trust their own voice a little bit, but also I think not to be so wedded to being so kind of on the nose and literal in terms of how we tackle politics or difficult subjects. And the great sort of privilege and thrill of reading a lot of literature, and for me especially Chinese literature, is it doesn't feel completely clear, and you can read between the lines. It creates space for complex ideas that don't feel too rammed down your throat. I know a lot of people think that the sort of heavy metaphors that tend to creep up counter that. I think But I really disagree. I feel like it, as you felt, it creates very sort of special and unique worlds that I don't really experience in fiction in the West. And I just love being part of them. It gives me a real sense of, as an outsider, what that writer has been trying to process and think about.
So I wanted to pivot a little bit. You talk about poetry in this book a bit, but the focus is definitely on long form fiction that is, mainly the novel or short stories. When I think of Chinese literature, I go back and I think of poetry as defining lots of Chinese literature for a long period. Then you have that discussion of the poet who killed himself, and his father says, he didn't even know his son was a poet. But poetry is not a way to get ahead. That's the old ways. The father says, I forget the line exactly, but that was the way to get ahead in the civil service exams. But today, it's not really helpful. Could you maybe speak a little bit about where poetry is today in terms of Chinese readers? Did you experience that they really don't care that much today about poetry? Is it important for kind of defining identity, but not important in terms of speaking to a modern audience? I'm trying to figure this out myself.
Yeah, it's something I actually don't know enough about myself. You can probably tell it wasn't a huge focus of the book, but as you know, poetry is historically the most important literary form in Chinese literature. And I think it still has a huge pull on old and young in terms of their connection with what is most celebrated and arguably, incredible about traditional Chinese literature. In terms of the present, I know there are various writers and critics and poets themselves who lament the demise of poetry as an art form. And certainly that's sort of put down to the fact that people just aren't, I think it's happening in the West as well, but people just don't have the time to kind of engage with brief complexity in the way that they are willing to engage with, a million words of very uncomplex fantasy. I think that's probably a worldwide issue rather than something that is problematic in China. But I certainly think that my experience of reading the migrant worker poets is that, their poetry is packed full of classical allusions and references, and it's proof of their own sort of very high standards of education that they've received and also pursued. But also I think the legacy of a lot of these poets, especially, Li Bai and Du Fu, who hold, young writers to sort of high standards, and they want to still be part of that, I guess, that sort of legacy. And certainly, even I think Liu Cixin writes this really wonderful story called The Poetry Cloud about the impossibility of ever recreating Li Bai's work, no matter how many algorithms you create to sort of churn out this sort of seemingly simple verse. It's really hard to know how popular it is, but I certainly don't think any Chinese person would say that it's not important.
I think that the discussion of the worker poetry in your book was maybe the most poignant, and it was really sharp.
Yeah, in fact, Leah, I don't know if you remember this, we actually interviewed Eleanor Goodman for the podcast a long time ago, and that interview got lost, I think because the sound quality was so bad that we never aired it, which was a bummer, because that was Iron Moon was a pretty thrilling collection of poetry. Megan, I wanted to pivot from high culture to low culture with web fiction. And I'm just so curious because I heard you on Seneca, and you mentioned that a lot of the stuff that you read for the book was in translation, which is what Lee and I do too. There's no shame in that. Reading everything, you can't get through this much material all in Chinese. But you also mentioned that the web fiction, because it's not translated, you had to read that in Chinese. And I'm curious I'm assuming it had to have taken. No, you're shaking your finger at it. Got it.
No, I didn't. I obviously read some things in a very sort of cursory way on Qidian and Jinjiang, but I basically used them to find which were the most popular novels and the most commented on novels, and then I would find inevitably quite dodgy or manful, admirable translations of them into English, of which there are many. So I then defaulted.
Wow. So actually, that leads to an even more fun question that I wasn't even planning to ask, but how do these read in translation? It seems to me like almost fan fiction level kind of stuff would be both easy and incredibly hard to translate. It's got to be packed full of popular references. They're reaching the biggest possible audience they can, which is deceptively hard to translate.
There are genuinely some really good translators. There's a guy called Deathblade who is a devoted translator of Argen, whose most famous book is I Shall Seal the Heavens, and he's a noticeably really good translator and loves the genre. But then I also think, it's kind of hard to tell where the problem lies. Obviously, things are translated very quickly, but they're also written in Chinese very quickly. And I don't assume that the quality is much better in Chinese. I haven't come across it being sort of exceptionally better in the original as the translation. And, I think people are reading it for scandal and whether it's sort of romance, it's whether, a best friend has betrayed the ordinary girl who is actually secretly in love with the hot Superman. Or I'm trying to think of another example. Men.
Do you even need another example?
Well,
That's the question. It's all the same example.
Well, or like, the sort of the young overlooked pipsqueak who just starts powering up and leveling up and becoming more and more powerful and vanquishing his foes. And it's all about kind of learning about the different tricks and the different moves and the different objects that enable them to do that. Of course, there's a bit of context within each bit, but they all end up sort of being the same thing. I think that's what people read them for, is just to plow through all of that, all of those kind of narratives. So I don't know is the answer, but I actually do. The one thing I do think is really noticeable is that it's quite a sort of moving community of young people who absolutely love these novels, both domestically and abroad. And they all support each other, and they're so grateful to people for translating them. I sort of have to just imagine that it's my age and the time at which I was born and my sort of tastes in books or something that mean that I can't really understand it. But like, so many people absolutely love it and devote years to translating the things that they love. So don't let me stop anybody from diving in if it sounds like that kind of thing.
Well, and one of the things I wanted to throw on the end there, and I'll let Lee ask his question here then. When I was reading your description of this stuff, all throughout I was thinking, this sounds like Netflix binge watching. I mean, everybody in the West already does this if they have access to streaming services. And these programs are designed by marketing firms and anyone else to be exactly this, right? The McDonald's of televised entertainment. Let's just make sure their interest is piqued and keep them coming back. The phrase you translated in that chapter, which was lust of the mind, was I thought very apropos, because this is exactly what happens. And it is fascinating how we don't have necessarily this kind of web fiction, but we absolutely throughout the West have stuff like this, right? None of these narratives are brand new. It's the same, the pipsqueak who gets kicked around and then rises up to become supreme ruler of the universe. Stuff like that is appealing across cultures.
Totally. And I think that the thing that is probably most similar in the West and is therefore going to increasingly mirror, I think China has done first. We have fan fiction, and it's a fervid and crazy environment. I think AO3 is the place that most people post on, but they are fanatical about the narratives that they, and the sort of self-inserts of girls falling in love with famous guys and vice versa. And I think they're really looking to the Chinese model to branch out into how to monetize it, basically. So watch this space. I think it's coming here pretty soon.
So that's actually a great segue to one of the last questions I wanted to ask is, you talk about how algorithmic this fiction is, how it's a lot of times just kind of about making stats and hitting a particular number of words. Do you see that coming for us outside of China? Do you see? I mean, you said watch this space. Like, is that something we should be expecting in fiction in the US and the UK?
I think I don't know. Primarily because we have a very different history of publishing books and engaging with books here, and obviously fan fiction is very different to sitting down and reading a novel and something that's been sort of carefully thought through and edited and turned into a hard copy. I certainly think that, in the era of Substack and people moving away from, I guess, kind of bigger organizations and trying to make money as influencers and things like that, I see no reason why that won't also happen in terms of content for kind of fiction. And I'm sure there are lots of people. I mean, I know that Chidian, I think it's the Western version is called Web Novel. They're desperately trying to get in on it here, and it's already very popular. The problem is that its sort of format means that writers don't really feel like they have a personal presence. As far as I can tell, they can't give much information about themselves. What people want to start doing is sort of cultivating their own brand of novel writing and charging people per chapter or per section to try and make money from it. And then, as you say, because we live in a world of Netflix and streaming, I'm sure there will be an attempt to sort of for these streaming services to create their own IP through these things, and if it's really popular, turn it into a TV show. It's a very good business model in China. It's not great for quality, I would say, but it's certainly great for business.
So, Lee, what do you think? Should we get Megan to arbitrate our 1980s debate?
Yeah, maybe as a way to kind of move this towards an end and give Megan a bit of a break. Rob, well, should you ask it, Rob?
So here's how it works. Lee and I have been planning for a while to do a series in the 1980s. And we got into a debate because what I wanted to do the series on was the 1980s as sort of the beginning of a new era in Chinese literature. For Lee, the 1980s is the clear best decade of Chinese arts and literature without any close second.
Post 1949.
Post 1940s, thank you. For me, I see the 1980s as beginning something, but most of my favorite stuff comes after the 1980s. So we're going to make you the judge here. Was the 1980s the single best decade after the Cultural Revolution, arts and literature, or was it just the beginning?
I mean, can I be really diplomatic and say both? I think I think clearly the 80s was so exciting in terms of what it was starting to do, and for obvious reasons we know with Tiananmen that the crackdowns that followed changed the nature of where that was all going, and I personally feel like it really wrong-footed something that was quite organic and thrilling, and it didn't mean that. And what it has created is the literature that I've, I guess, been focusing on, which has had to come up with, equally innovative and sort of exciting ways of broaching that. But I also would have loved to have seen what would have happened had that not been interrupted. So it's a kind of alternate reality form of arbitration where you're both right.
I don't know about that, Lee. Is that past muster? Are we both allowed to be right? I mean, I'm usually comfortable in a universe where you're wrong, so I don't know how this is going to work with us cohabiting in the same place.
You get two universes with my answer.
That's true. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that.
It's very Chinese science fiction kind of answer, right?
Yeah. You get Yan Lian Ko, but you also get whatever the 1980s might have produced otherwise.
Megan, I think that's a great place to end it. Sorry for putting you on the spot there. Do you have any do you have any final thoughts before we go?
No, I actually just wanted to say how much I've really enjoyed listening to your podcast. You know a lot more than I do about anything pre-1980s, and so I'm very grateful for all the tips and the sort of foundational stuff you've given me over the last few years.
Well, thanks for returning the favor and giving us all the info about the last two decades, because I guarantee we were never planning on doing a series on web fiction.
And now's your chance. Great. I can't wait to hear it.
Rob, do you want to do something on Danmei fiction?
Possibly. I mean, you know, as long as we're going to web fiction, let's just go all the way, right?
So definitely go, listeners, definitely go check out Megan's book. You can find it. Should we just link to your website? How should we do it?
That would be great. Yeah, thanks.
And so it's Subplot. This is Megan Walsh. Thank you so much again for joining us. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.